Throughout history, the belief that evil spirits can invade and control the human body has crossed every culture, every religion, and every continent. And while most people hear the word exorcism and think of Hollywood movies and spinning heads and green vomit, the truth is far more disturbing than fiction, because in the cases you're about to hear, people actually died. These are real stories, real victims, and real consequences of what happens when the line between faith and violence disappears completely. In the Bavarian countryside of southern Germany, in the small town of Leibelfing, a girl named Anneliese Michel came into the world on September 21st, 1952. She was born into a household that breathed Catholicism the way most families breathe air. Her parents, Joseph and Anna Michel, weren't just religious. They were devout in the truest, most old-world sense of the word. The family attended Mass twice a week, observed every holy day, and raised their children to fear God and revere the church above all things. And in this household, sin wasn't just a concept. It was a constant, hovering presence that demanded vigilance. For young Anneliese, this upbringing created a foundation of deep, almost obsessive piety. She prayed regularly, she followed the rules, and she internalized the teachings of the church with an intensity that went beyond what most children her age could even comprehend. But beneath the surface of this seemingly normal, if unusually religious childhood, something was already stirring. Something that would one day consume her entirely. When Anneliese was 16 years old, everything changed. She was sitting in class one day when her body suddenly seized, her muscles locked, her eyes rolled, and she collapsed. It was terrifying for everyone around her, and when she was taken to the hospital, doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition that causes seizures originating in the part of the brain responsible for emotion, memory, and sensory processing. It was a serious diagnosis, but it was also a medical one rooted in science, and doctors prescribed Tegretol, an anticonvulsant medication, to manage her symptoms. For a while, the medication seemed to help. Anneliese continued her education, eventually enrolling at the University of Würzburg to study education. She was intelligent, driven, and determined to live a normal life despite her condition. But the seizures were only the beginning. By the time she reached her early 20s, Anneliese began experiencing something far more disturbing than convulsions. She started hearing voices. Not the kind of internal monologue that everyone has, but distinct external voices that whispered terrible things to her. They told her she was damned. They told her she was beyond saving. And then, as if the voices weren't enough, she began seeing things too. Grotesque, demonic faces that appeared to her during prayer, leering at her from the shadows. She became deeply depressed, and at times, suicidal. Doctors adjusted her medications, adding antipsychotic drugs to the mix, but nothing seemed to stop the descent. And then things got physical. Anneliese developed an intense, almost violent aversion to anything religious. Crucifixes made her recoil. She couldn't drink holy water. She couldn't walk past religious images without feeling a surge of revulsion so powerful it was almost painful. For a young woman raised in one of the most devoutly Catholic households in Bavaria, this was beyond alarming. It was, to her family, proof that something more than medicine could explain was happening to their daughter. An older woman who was friends with the Michel family noticed Anneliese's deterioration during a religious pilgrimage. She later described the young woman as smelling, in her words, hellishly bad, and noted that Anneliese refused to walk past a particular image of Jesus during the trip. This friend took Anneliese to see several priests, most of whom told the family that what she needed was a doctor, not a clergyman. But one priest disagreed. He saw something else entirely. Father Ernst Alt became involved with Anneliese's case and quickly became convinced that her suffering was not medical in nature, but spiritual. He believed she was possessed. Together with another elderly Jesuit priest, Father Adolf Rodevig, Alt compiled a detailed report of Anneliese's symptoms and behaviors and presented it to Bishop Josef Stangl, petitioning for permission to perform an exorcism according to the Rituale Romanum, the Catholic Church's official rite for driving out demons. The bishop was cautious at first. The Catholic Church has strict criteria for approving an exorcism, including evidence of supernatural knowledge, an aversion to sacred objects, and unusual physical strength. But eventually, after reviewing the evidence, Stangl granted permission and assigned Salvatorian priest Father Arnold Renz to carry out the rite. There was one condition, though. The exorcism had to be conducted in total secrecy. Nobody outside the immediate circle was to know. The first exorcism session took place on September 24th, 1975. And from that moment on, Anneliese Michel's life became a waking nightmare. Over the next 10 months, she would endure 67 exorcism sessions, sometimes 1 or 2 per week, each lasting up to 4 hours. The sessions were intense, grueling, and physically devastating. Anneliese would scream, growl, and contort her body. She spoke in voices that were not her own, voices that identified themselves as Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Cain, Hitler, and others. The so-called demons argued with each other during the sessions, and Anneliese's personality seemed to fracture and splinter under the weight of it all. During these months, 42 of the sessions were recorded on audio tape. Those recordings still exist today, and they are deeply unsettling. Anneliese's voice shifts between her own terrified pleas and deep guttural growls that sound nothing like a young woman. She screams obscenities at the priests, curses God, and begs for the torment to stop. And through it all, Anneliese began to speak about her suffering in terms that went beyond self-preservation. She talked about dying to atone for the sins of wayward youth and corrupt priests. She began to see her pain as a sacrifice, something holy and necessary. As the exorcisms continued, Anneliese's physical condition deteriorated catastrophically. She stopped eating, at first gradually, and then almost entirely. She injured herself during the sessions, performing hundreds of genuflections, the act of kneeling and rising in prayer until her knees shattered. The tendons and bones in both knees broke from the repetitive motion. And still she continued. She drank her own urine. She ate insects off the floor. She would sit under the kitchen table and bark like a dog for days at a time. Her family, convinced that the exorcisms were working and that the demons were being driven out, stopped seeking medical help altogether. They put their daughter's fate entirely in the hands of the 2 priests. By the summer of 1976, Anneliese Michel was a ghost of the young woman she had once been. She was emaciated, her body ravaged by months of starvation and self-harm. She was suffering from pneumonia, her immune system destroyed by malnutrition. And still the exorcisms continued. On July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel died in her home in the town of Klingenberg am Main. She was 23 years old. At the time of her death, she weighed just 68 pounds. Her body was covered in bruises, sores, and the evidence of months of suffering. The official cause of death was malnutrition and dehydration. Doctors who later examined the case stated plainly that Anneliese could have been saved even in the final days of her life if someone had simply taken her to a hospital and given her food and water. In the aftermath, Germany was shaken. The case became a national scandal, and the state charged Anneliese's parents, Josef and Anneliese Michel, along with priests Ernst Alt and Arnold Rentz, with negligent homicide. The trial began on March 30th, 1978, and it drew intense public scrutiny. Prosecutors played the audio recordings of the exorcism sessions in the courtroom, and the sounds that filled that room left many in the gallery visibly shaken. Doctors testified that Anneliese had never been possessed at all, that her symptoms were consistent with a combination of epilepsy, psychosis, and religious delusion, all of which could have been treated with proper medical care. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the exorcisms were conducted in good faith, and that the family and priests genuinely believed they were saving Anneliese's soul. Anneliese's parents were represented by Erich Schmidt-Leichner, a famed attorney who had previously defended Nazi war criminals at the Nuremberg trials. The church quietly covered the priest's legal fees. The courtroom proceedings were intense and deeply emotional. The prosecution argued that Anneliese's symptoms could be fully explained by her diagnosed conditions, epilepsy and psychosis, worsened by religious delusions that had been reinforced rather than treated. Medical experts testified that she could have been saved even in the final days before her death if someone had simply brought her to a hospital and administered intravenous fluids and nutrition. The defense countered that the parents and priests had acted out of love and genuine belief, not malice, and that punishing them would serve no purpose. The court listened to selections from the 42 audio recordings, and the effect on those in the gallery was visceral. People wept. Some left the room. The sounds on those tapes, the screaming, the guttural voices, the desperate pleas, were a haunting testament to the suffering Anneliese had endured in her final months. On April 1st, 1978, the verdict came down. All 4 defendants were found guilty of negligent homicide. But the sentences were strikingly lenient. Each was given 6 months in prison, which was immediately suspended and converted to 3 years of probation. They also received a fine. In effect, nobody went to prison for Anneliese Michel's death. Her mother, Anna, expressed no regret. She reportedly stated that there had been no other way. The Michel parents later had Anneliese's body exhumed in 1978, hoping to find it incorrupt, a sign of sainthood in Catholic tradition. According to reports, the body had decomposed normally. But this did nothing to shake the family's conviction that their daughter had been fighting a battle against genuine evil. Anneliese Michel's grave in the cemetery at Klingenberg has become something of a pilgrimage site in the years since her death. Fresh flowers are regularly placed there by visitors who believe she was genuinely possessed and that her suffering was a form of sainthood. The Catholic Church has never officially commented on whether Anneliese was truly possessed, but the case prompted significant changes in how the Church approaches exorcism, including updated guidelines issued in 1999 that urge priests to consider modern psychiatric diagnoses before resorting to the rite. Her story went on to inspire the 2005 film The Exorcism of Emily Rose, as well as the 2006 German film Requiem and a 2011 documentary. But no film has ever quite captured the true horror of what happened to Anneliese Michel, because the reality was worse than anything a screenwriter could imagine. Now, if Anneliese's story represents the slow, grinding tragedy of an exorcism that killed its subject over the course of months, then the case that unfolded in the quiet English town of Ossett, West Yorkshire, is something else entirely. This is the story of what happens when an exorcism doesn't just fail, but unleashes something far worse than anyone could have predicted. And it happened over the course of a single, blood-soaked morning. In 1974, Michael Taylor was 31 years old, a butcher by trade, and by all accounts a kind, mild-mannered man. He lived in the Havercroft district of Ossett with his wife, Christine, their 5 children, and the family dog. Neighbors described the Taylors as a happy, cheerful household, and Michael himself was known as a gentle, loving father and husband. He did, however, suffer from chronic back pain due to a severe injury sustained years earlier, and this left him prone to bouts of depression and an inability to hold consistent work. The Taylors weren't particularly religious, but when a friend suggested that joining a local Christian fellowship group might lift Michael's spirits, the couple decided to give it a try. They joined the Gauber Christian Fellowship Group, a charismatic congregation that met regularly at St. Thomas's Church in Gauber, a village just south of Ossett. At first, the group seemed to be exactly what Michael needed. He found community, purpose, and a sense of belonging that had been missing from his life. But then Michael met Marie Robinson, the lay leader of the fellowship group, and something shifted. Robinson was described as charismatic and magnetic, and Michael quickly developed an attraction to her. His wife, Christine, noticed. During one meeting, Christine publicly accused Michael of having a carnal relationship with Robinson. Michael, clearly agitated, admitted that he felt something evil within himself. The group encouraged him to work through the issue privately with Robinson. The two entered a bedroom alone. What happened in that room was brief but significant. Michael made a pass at Robinson, and she rejected him. When they emerged, Robinson told the group exactly what had happened in front of Christine and everyone else. Michael snapped. He verbally attacked Robinson, screaming at her with a fury that stunned everyone present. Robinson screamed back. The atmosphere in the room turned electric with tension, and from that moment on, Michael Taylor was a different man. In the days and weeks that followed, Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. He was prone to violent outbursts. He broke household items, and in some accounts, he threw the Vincent's cat out of a window during a home visit. He appeared tormented, as if something inside him was clawing its way to the surface. The leaders of the fellowship group, including Peter and Sally Vincent, observed Michael's deterioration with growing alarm and came to a conclusion that, in their minds, explained everything. Michael Taylor was possessed by demons. The decision was made to perform an exorcism. On the night of October 5th, 1974, Michael and Christine Taylor were summoned to St. Thomas's Church in Gauber. Waiting for them were Father Peter Vincent, an Anglican priest, and the Reverend Raymond Smith, a Methodist clergyman, along with other members of the fellowship group. The exorcism began around midnight. What followed was an all-night ordeal that stretched into the early hours of the following morning. For roughly 8 hours, the clergymen and congregation members attempted to cast out what they believed were over 40 separate demons inhabiting Michael's body. One by one, they claimed to identify and expel demons of incest, bestiality, blasphemy, lewdness, and dozens of others. Michael thrashed, screamed, and resisted. The group restrained him and continued their prayers and incantations, hour after exhausting hour. By dawn on October 6th, the exorcists were spent. They had been at it all night, and they believed they had successfully expelled the majority of the demons. But there was a problem. They acknowledged openly that at least 3 demons remained inside Michael Taylor, and the 3 they couldn't get out were the demons of murder, violence, and insanity. Despite this deeply troubling admission, the exhausted group made the decision to let Michael and Christine go home. What happened next is almost impossible to comprehend. Shortly after arriving home, Michael Taylor turned on his wife with a savagery that defies description. Using only his bare hands, he attacked Christine with such force that a responding officer would later say he had never seen anything like it in his career. Michael tore out Christine's eyes. He tore out her tongue. He nearly ripped her face completely off. He then killed and dismembered the family's pet poodle. When police arrived, they found Michael Taylor wandering the streets of Ossett, completely naked and drenched in blood from head to toe. When officers approached him, he reportedly told them that it was the blood of Satan. He claimed the exorcism had failed, that the demons had taken control, and that he had been compelled by a force within him to destroy everything living in the house. 5 children had lost their mother that morning, and they had, for all practical purposes, lost their father too. Michael Taylor's trial began in March of 1975 and drew enormous public attention. The prosecution laid out the horrific details of Christine's death, and the defense argued that Michael's fragile mental state had been pushed past the breaking point by the traumatic exorcism. A clinical psychologist testified that the trauma of the all-night ritual, combined with Michael's pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities, had effectively shattered his mind. No motive for the murder was ever established. Michael Taylor was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital, where he spent 2 years receiving treatment. He then spent an additional 2 years at Bradford Royal Infirmary before being released. After his release, Michael returned to Ossett, where he reportedly attempted to take his own life on 4 separate occasions. In 2005, he made headlines again when he was arrested for the indecent assault of a teenage girl, and was once again sent for psychiatric observation. No members of the church were ever charged in connection with Christine Taylor's death. Peter Vinson was quietly relocated to another congregation and died in 2017. The Anglican Church, for its part, argued that the case didn't prove exorcisms were dangerous, only that they should always be completed before the subject is released. In other words, the lesson they took from Christine Taylor's murder was not that the exorcism should never have happened, but that the exorcists should have finished the job. Now, across the Atlantic, and just a few years later, another case would test the boundaries of how far the belief in demonic possession could reach, not just in a church or a home, but inside a courtroom. This is the story that would come to be known as "The Devil Made Me Do It," and it began not with the man who would eventually stand trial for murder, but with a little boy who claimed to see a demon. In the summer of 1980, in the small town of Brookfield, Connecticut, 11-year-old David Glatzel began experiencing what his family described as terrifying supernatural encounters. It started after David and his older sister Debbie's fiancé, a 19-year-old tree surgeon named Arne Cheyenne Johnson, were cleaning out a rental property. David reportedly told his family that he had seen a frightening figure, an old man with dark, hollow eyes, who warned him to stay away. In the days that followed, David's behavior changed dramatically. He had nightmares. He woke up screaming. He began speaking in strange voices and exhibiting what his family interpreted as signs of demonic possession. The Glatzel family, frightened and desperate, reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren. the famous self-described demonologists from Connecticut who had previously investigated cases like the Amityville haunting. The Warrens visited the Glatzel home and quickly concluded that David was under demonic influence. They facilitated multiple sessions in which Catholic priests attempted to expel the entities from the boy. During these sessions, David reportedly levitated, contorted his body, recited the names of 42 demons in Latin, and displayed unusual physical strength. Arne Johnson was present for many of these sessions, and what happened next would change the course of his life forever. According to the Glatzel family and the Warrens, during one particularly intense session, Arne stepped forward and challenged the demon directly. He dared it to leave David alone and enter his own body instead. Whether or not one believes in the supernatural, what is documented is that from that point forward, Arne's behavior began to change. He became prone to sudden trances. He would growl and speak in voices that weren't his own, and then have no memory of the episodes afterward. In one account, he reportedly punched his fist through a chest of drawers with no explanation, and in another, he fell roughly 100 feet without sustaining serious injury. Months passed, and by early 1981, Arne was a volatile, unpredictable version of the young man he had once been. Then, on February 16, 1981, everything came to a head. That evening, Arne and Debbie were at the home of their landlord, Alan Bono, a 40-year-old man who owned the property where they lived and also ran a nearby dog kennel business. The three had been drinking, and at some point, an argument broke out. The exact cause of the fight remains disputed, though police believed it was related to Debbie. What is not disputed is what happened next. Arne Johnson pulled out a 5-inch folding pocket knife and stabbed Alan Bono repeatedly in the chest and abdomen. Bono bled to death. It was the first recorded homicide in Brookfield's 193 years of existence. Arne fled into the nearby woods and was arrested by police about an hour later. The day after the killing, Lorraine Warren contacted the Brookfield police and told them that Arne had been possessed by a demon at the time of the murder. This revelation set off a media firestorm. Arne's attorney, 33-year-old Martin Minella, announced that he would enter a plea of not guilty by reason of demonic possession, the first time such a defense had ever been attempted in an American courtroom. Minella traveled to England to consult with lawyers who had been involved in similar cases, including the Michael Taylor case, and planned to bring exorcism specialists from Europe to testify. The trial began on October 28, 1981, at Connecticut's Superior Court in Danbury. Reporters from across the country and around the world descended on the small courthouse. But their excitement was short-lived. Presiding Judge Robert Callahan shut down the demonic possession defense before it could even begin. He ruled that evidence of possession was irrelevant, unprovable, and would only serve to confuse the jury. The demon defense was out. Without his most sensational argument, Minella was left to argue self-defense, which proved unsuccessful. On November 24, 1981, the jury convicted Arne Cheyenne Johnson of first-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, but served only about 5 years before being released on good behavior. After prison, Arne married Debbie Glatzel, and the couple maintained for the rest of their lives that the demonic possession was real. The case, however, was far from universally accepted. David Glatzel's older brother, Carl, later claimed publicly that the entire possession story was a hoax orchestrated by the Warrens to exploit his family and profit from book and movie deals. He filed a lawsuit against Gerald Brittle, the author of The Devil in Connecticut, the book based on the case, claiming that most of what was written was fabricated. The Warrens denied the allegations, and the controversy has simmered for decades. The case inspired the 2021 film The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, as well as a 2023 Netflix documentary called The Devil on Trial, which explored both sides of the story. What makes the Arne Johnson case so chilling isn't necessarily whether the possession was real. It's the fact that a man died, and the primary defense offered for his killing was that the murderer simply wasn't in control of his own body. Whether you believe that's possible, or terrifying, or absurd, the result was the same. Alan Bono, a 40-year-old landlord who had simply been having drinks at his own home, was dead. Now, if the American legal system drew a firm line in the sand when it came to demonic possession as a defense, the events that unfolded in the remote hills of northeastern Romania a quarter century later would test an entirely different set of boundaries, the boundaries between faith, isolation, and the value of a human life. Marisica Irina Cornici was born in 1982 in rural Romania into circumstances that seemed designed to produce tragedy. Her childhood was defined by poverty so deep it was almost medieval. Her father, broken by the hopelessness of his situation, took his own life when Irina was still a small child. Her mother, described in accounts as violent and dependent on alcohol, abandoned Irina and her brother Vasile shortly thereafter. The two children were placed in the Barlad Children's Home in Vaslui County, one of Romania's state-run orphanages, institutions that were notorious remnants of the Ceausescu era, plagued by overcrowding, malnutrition, and neglect. Irina grew up in that orphanage, surviving but never thriving. When she aged out of the system at 18, she entered a world she was profoundly unprepared for. She worked briefly as a housekeeper, then as a nanny in Germany, saving what money she could and dreaming of a better life. A friend from the orphanage who had become a nun at the Holy Trinity Monastery in the remote village of Tanaku encouraged Irina to visit, and in early 2005, 23-year-old Irina Cornici arrived at the monastery, initially intending to convince her friend to emigrate to Germany with her. But something about the monastery spoke to Irina. For the first time in her life, she found what felt like a family. The community of nuns offered structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging she had never experienced. She decided to stay, taking on the role of a novice nun. For a brief period, things seemed stable, but the stability didn't last. Soon after her arrival, Irina began behaving strangely. She giggled during Mass. She became agitated and unpredictable. By April of 2005, her mental state had deteriorated so badly that she was taken to the local psychiatric hospital in Vaslui, where doctors diagnosed her with schizophrenia. They treated her for 2 weeks and then released her back into the care of the monastery, a decision that would prove fatal. Back at the monastery, Irina's condition continued to worsen. She became violent, sometimes directing the aggression at herself. She set fire to her cell. She spoke in ways that the nuns and the monastery's leader, Father Daniel Petre Corogeanu, interpreted not as symptoms of mental illness, but as evidence of demonic possession. Corogeanu was a young, charismatic priest who had never completed his theological studies, but he wielded enormous influence over the nuns, who were described as completely devoted to him. He decided that Irina needed an exorcism. Father Daniel Petre Corogeanu was not your typical Romanian Orthodox priest. Born in rural Romania, he had initially wanted to study sports or law at the University of Bucharest, but was unable to secure admission. He turned instead to religious studies at the University of Iași, though he would never complete his education. A local businessman recruited him to help build a monastery in the hills near his hometown, and Coragianu threw himself into the project with a zeal that impressed the local bishop, who ordained him with the expectation that he would continue his studies. He never did. The original community of monks at the monastery dissolved as its members left to become parish priests elsewhere, and Coragianu reorganized the community around a group of young nuns who were, by all accounts, completely devoted to him. He ran the monastery with an iron grip, and by 2003, he had begun clashing with the local diocese over church canon law, dismissing established rules as 19th century innovations created by Freemasonry. It was into this isolated, personality-driven environment that Irina Cornici walked in early 2005. A vulnerable young woman with no family, no safety net, and a psychiatric condition that was about to be misinterpreted with fatal consequences. What followed over the next several days in June 2005 was medieval in its cruelty. Irina was bound to a makeshift stretcher constructed from rough wooden boards, a device that resembled a cross. Her hands and feet were tied. She was gagged with a towel, and she was left in a dank, dark room at the convent without food or water for 3 days, while Coragianu and 4 nuns, Nicoleta Arcalianu, Adina Chapraga, Elena Otel, and Simona Bardanas, performed their rituals over her. On June 23, 2005, after 3 days of deprivation and restraint, Irina's body finally gave out. When an ambulance was eventually called, the paramedics found her without a pulse. The initial autopsy determined that she had died of dehydration, exhaustion, and suffocation. Her aunt, who saw the body, later described it as disfigured, with marks on her hands, ankles, and stomach. The reaction in Romania was one of shock and outrage. The case made international headlines and forced the country to confront uncomfortable truths about the role of religion in its post-communist society. Father Coragianu and the 4 nuns were arrested and charged with aggravated murder and depriving a person of liberty. Prosecutors sought a life sentence. At trial, Coragianu showed little remorse. He maintained that he had done God's work and that the true tragedy was not being able to complete the exorcism. As Irina was lowered into her grave during the funeral, witnesses reported hearing claps of thunder, which Coragianu took as confirmation that God's will had been done. In 2007, Coragianu was sentenced to 14 years in prison, though the Court of Appeals later reduced this to 7 years. He was freed on parole in November 2011 after serving 2/3 of his sentence. The nuns received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years. The Romanian Orthodox Church condemned the ritual as abominable, defrocked Coragianu, excommunicated the nuns, and implemented new rules requiring psychological testing for anyone seeking to enter a monastery. But for Irina Cornici, a young woman who had spent her entire life searching for a place to belong, these reforms came far too late. Half a world away from the Romanian hills, in the vast sun-scorched flatlands of rural Victoria, Australia, another woman was about to become the victim of an exorcism performed not by clergy, but by ordinary people who believed they were soldiers in a spiritual war. Joan Vollmer was 49 years old in January of 1993, a quiet woman who lived on a pig farm near the tiny outback town of Antwerp with her husband, Ralph Vollmer, a 54-year-old farmer. Joan suffered from schizophrenia, a condition for which she had been hospitalized in the past. She was, by all accounts, a gentle person who loved her garden and her animals and lived a modest, unremarkable life in one of the most isolated corners of southeastern Australia. But Ralph Vollmer didn't see his wife's illness the way doctors did. When Joan began acting strangely in mid-January 1993, dancing wildly outside the house, yelling, waving her arms, and using language she normally never used, Ralph didn't call a psychiatrist. He called his friends from a small, fringe Christian fellowship group, a charismatic splinter faction that had been expelled from the mainstream Lutheran church. The first to arrive were John Reichenbach, 38, and his wife Leanne, 30. Together with Ralph, they assessed the situation and came to a unanimous conclusion. Joan was possessed by demons, 10 of them, in fact. Among the spirits they claimed to identify were the spirit of filth, the spirit of abuse, and one called Legion, a biblical reference to a demon with the strength of thousands. What began as prayer quickly escalated into physical restraint. Joan was tied down, first to her bed, then to a chair. She was denied food and water under the belief that nourishing her body would also nourish the demons within. She screamed, she begged, she struggled against her bonds, but the group held firm, convinced that her protests were the voices of the demons fighting to maintain their hold. Over the next several days, 2 more people joined the exorcism. David Klingner, 28, arrived to assist, and the group slapped Joan across the face and held her down more forcefully. Then, on January 30th, the final participant arrived from Melbourne, over 450 kilometers away. His name was Matthew Nuska, a 22-year-old assistant greenkeeper at a golf course whose mother believed he possessed special spiritual gifts. Nuski took charge of the ritual with a bizarre confidence that belied his youth and lack of any theological training. He blessed olive oil and had the group douse themselves with it. Then he took a box of plastic cling wrap and circled the entire house 7 times, wrapping it around the structure and over the roof to seal the doors and windows against demons. The scene would have been almost comical if a woman's life hadn't been hanging in the balance. The final push to expel the demons involved the group holding Joan down while trying to force the evil spirits up and out through her mouth. They pressed on her body, her neck, her chest. According to the autopsy that followed, Joan's thyroid cartilage, the piece of cartilage in the throat commonly known as the Adam's apple, was fractured from the sustained pressure applied to her neck. Her heart gave out. Joan Vollmer died on the afternoon of January 30th, 1993, after approximately 4 days of captivity and abuse at the hands of people who genuinely believed they were saving her soul. But the story doesn't end there, because Ralph Vollmer didn't call the police. He didn't call an ambulance. Instead, he waited. The group had received what they described as phone calls from people who were very sensitive to the Lord, spiritual contacts who told them that God was going to raise Joan from the dead. So they left her body in the farmhouse and waited for the resurrection. By Monday, February 1st, the temperatures in rural Victoria were approaching 40 degrees Celsius, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Joan's body had begun to swell and decompose. Flies gathered. The smell became unbearable. And still Ralph waited, clinging to his faith that his wife would rise. It wasn't until midday on February 1st that Ralph finally decided to report Joan's death, though even then, he set a second resurrection date to coincide with the funeral scheduled for February 5th. In a television interview that shocked the nation, Ralph Vollmer looked into the camera and said, with absolute conviction, that God was going to raise Joan up before her body was lowered into the grave, and he wanted the cameras there to witness it. The resurrection, of course, never came. Ralph Vollmer was ultimately acquitted of manslaughter at trial, a verdict that outraged many Australians. The defense argued that Ralph had genuinely believed his wife was possessed and that the exorcism was an act of love, however misguided. Two of the other participants were convicted of manslaughter. Leanne Reichenbach was sentenced to 4 months in prison for her role, and Matthew Nuske was also convicted and sentenced. The farmhouse where Joan died was abandoned immediately afterward and has sat empty for decades since, its windows boarded up, its rooms untouched, the cling wrap long since disintegrated. It has become something of a macabre landmark in the Victorian countryside, a place where local teenagers dare each other to visit on dark nights and hold seances in the rooms where a woman was tortured to death. Some claim the house is haunted, which carries a bitter irony given the circumstances of Joan's death. Ralph Vollmer eventually remarried and moved to Queensland with his third wife, leaving behind the Antwerp property and the memories of what happened there. Joan Vollmer's story eventually became the basis for a stage play called Furious Mattress, which examines the ethics of turning real-life tragedy into art. But for Joan herself, there was no second act, only silence and a lonely house on a dusty road that nobody wants to enter. The pattern of isolation, religious fervor, and fatal violence that defined Joan Vollmer's death in the Australian outback found an even more savage echo in the jungles of Central America, where, in 2017, a young mother's life was extinguished in the most horrific way imaginable. Vilma Trujillo Garcia was 25 years old, a mother of 2 small children, ages 2 and 5, living in the remote village of El Cortazal in the Rosita municipality of northeastern Nicaragua. El Cortazal is the kind of place most maps forget, a tiny settlement carved out of dense tropical terrain, far from paved roads, hospitals, or any meaningful government presence. In communities like this, the local pastor often holds more authority than any elected official, and for the people of El Cortazal, that pastor was a 23-year-old man named Juan Gregorio Rocha Romero. In mid-February 2017, Vilma reportedly began acting erratically. Some accounts suggest she may have been experiencing a mental health crisis. Others say she allegedly threatened people with a machete. Whatever the trigger, Pastor Rocha arrived at Vilma's home on February 15th and told the family he would take her to his church to give her a prayer of healing. Vilma's husband, Rinaldo Peralta Rodriguez, allowed it. He had no reason to suspect what would come next. For the next 6 days, from February 15th through February 21st, Vilma was held inside the small evangelical chapel that Rocha ran. She was bound, denied food and water, and subjected to continuous prayer sessions intended to drive the demon from her body. Her family was told not to visit. When her father and cousin tried to see her, Rocha turned them away, telling them not to feel any love for the woman they saw, because what they were looking at was not Vilma anymore. It was the devil. Then came, February 21st. According to the account given by the church leader, Esneida del Socorro Orozco, she had received a divine revelation that instructed the group to build a campfire in the courtyard of the church and bring the sick woman near the fire so that the demon would leave her body and enter the flames. So that is what they did. Vilma Trujillo Garcia was stripped naked. Her hands and feet were bound, and she was thrown onto a pile of burning wood. Witnesses said she was left in the fire, tied to a tree trunk for approximately 5 hours. The heat reached an estimated 400 degrees Celsius. she suffered first and second-degree burns over 80% of her body. After the burning, Vilma's body was left in a gully near the banks of a river. It was her 15-year-old sister who found her nearly 9 hours later, barely alive but horribly disfigured. Vilma was transported to a hospital in Managua, the nation's capital, where she lingered in critical condition for a week before dying on February 28, 2017. The news of Vilma's death sent shockwaves through Nicaragua and around the world. Pastor Rocha denied responsibility, claiming that Vilma had thrown herself into the fire because she was demonized, and that a demon had been expelled from her body at the moment she fell. But witnesses, forensic evidence, and the testimony of Vilma's own relatives painted a very different picture. Rocha and 4 of his followers were arrested, tried, and found guilty of homicide with aggravating circumstances. The trial, which was broadcast live on Nicaraguan television, featured devastating testimony from Vilma's relatives. Her cousin Roberto Trujillo told the court how the pastor had instructed them not to feel any love for Vilma during the ritual, because what they were seeing was just the devil, and that she had to be burned until only her head was left. Vilma's sister Marlene testified that she had tried to see her sister during the week of captivity, but was turned away, with Rocha telling her not to pay any attention because Vilma was possessed by a demon. The judge noted that Vilma had been bound, deprived of food and water for days, and deliberately placed in the fire. A forensics expert testified that she had been subjected to temperatures of 400 degrees Celsius. All 5 defendants received the maximum sentence under Nicaraguan law, 30 years in prison. Vilma's husband, Ronaldo, was left to raise their 2 small children alone. As he left the morgue carrying his wife's coffin, he told reporters that what they did was unforgivable and asked what he was supposed to tell their children. The killing of Vilma Trujillo Garcia was described by the auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Managua as a product of fanaticism and religious ignorance. Human rights organizations called it an act of femicide, the killing of a woman driven by gender-based violence dressed in religious justification. But in El Cortazal, the reaction was more complicated. Many villagers continued to support Pastor Rocha, viewing him as a man of God who had been unfairly persecuted. The silence in that village was as thick as the jungle surrounding it. Now, while the Vilma Trujillo case stands out for its sheer brutality, it was far from the first time that exorcism-related violence had claimed a life in the Americas. In fact, throughout the 1990s, a string of deadly exorcisms among Korean Christian communities in California exposed a disturbing intersection of immigrant isolation, religious extremism, and deadly violence. On March 8, 1995, in the city of Emeryville, California, near Oakland, a 25-year-old Korean woman named Kyung-ah died during an exorcism conducted by members of a small fundamentalist sect called the Jesus Amen Ministries. Ha had come to the United States from South Korea to visit relatives and was suffering from chronic insomnia. Her younger sister, a recent convert to Pentecostalism, had introduced her to Jean Park, the self-proclaimed reverend who led the tiny sect from a 3-bedroom apartment that doubled as their place of worship. Park told the family that she could cure Ha's insomnia through prayer, and Ha was moved into the apartment. But it quickly became clear that Ha was not there voluntarily. She telephoned relatives and begged them to come rescue her. Instead, Park decided Ha's insomnia was the work of demons and scheduled an exorcism. In the early hours of March 8th, Park convened a prayer meeting to cast out the spirits. While 3 other women held Ha down, Park and her 52-year-old mother, Hua Ja Ra, beat the young woman savagely. They struck her as many as 100 times on the chest and face, believing they were hitting the demons, not the person. Ha tried to protect her chest, which the group believed to be the stronghold of the demonic presence. She cried out, but her screams were muffled with a towel. The beating sounds were loud enough to be heard by other members in adjacent rooms. By the time the exorcism was over, Kyung-ah was dead. At least 10 of her ribs were broken. She had defecated on herself from the trauma, and instead of calling for help, the members of the Jesus Amen Ministries allegedly left her body in the apartment for days before notifying police. When authorities finally arrived, Jean Park reportedly told them that the killing was a victory for Jesus Christ. Park was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and the case exposed the dangerous world of fringe Korean evangelical movements operating in the shadows of American immigrant communities. Just over a year later, on July 4th, 1996, another exorcism death struck the Korean American community, this time in Los Angeles. Kyung Jae-chung, a 53-year-old mother of 2 teenagers, died after a 6-hour exorcism session in a Century City condominium. Chung and her husband, Jae-wo Chung, were Methodist missionaries who ran a Christian school in Dhaka, Bangladesh. They were visiting Los Angeles on church business when Jae-wo became convinced his wife was possessed, allegedly because she had been acting spiritually arrogant and had disobeyed him. He enlisted the help of Sung-soo Choi, a visiting reverend, and Jin Hyun Choi, a deacon at the Glendale Calvary Presbyterian Church. The 3 men began praying over Kyung Jae in the apartment, but after about 2.5 hours, the session took a violent turn. They pinned her to the bed and demanded to know who she was. According to the men, she responded in a deep, harsh voice, growling the word Gunday, which translates to legion, a reference to the biblical demon of great power. The men attempted to force the demon out, and the voice inside Kyung Jae allegedly told them it would only leave when she was dead. Over the next 4 hours, the 3 men beat Kyung Jae with devastating force. They stomped on her stomach and chest. They crushed the muscles in her leg. By the time it was over, Kyung Jae-chung's heart had been crushed against her backbone. She had 16 fractured ribs and deep bruising on her pancreas and abdominal muscles. She was pronounced dead at Century City Hospital a few hours later. Her 2 teenage daughters were left motherless. At trial, all 3 men were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The exorcist, Sung-soo Choi, received the maximum sentence of 4 years in prison. Kyung Jae's husband received 2 years. The deacon, Jin Hyun Choi, who had pleaded guilty and testified against the other 2, received 60 days in jail, 3 years of probation, and 200 hours of community service. The judge acknowledged that all 3 men had acted with genuine belief that they were healing the victim, but noted that their failure to exercise basic caution made them legally responsible for her death. These 2 cases, occurring within roughly a year of each other, offered a troubling glimpse into a pattern of violence that thrived in communities where cultural isolation, language barriers, and fervent religious belief created an environment where exorcism could become a death sentence. And tragically, they were not the last, because in September of 2021, in a quiet residential neighborhood in San Jose, California, a 3-year-old girl named Aurelie Naomi Proctor became what may be the youngest victim of a fatal exorcism in modern American history. And the people who killed her were the very people entrusted with her care: her own mother, her uncle, and her grandfather. The family attended a small makeshift Pentecostal church called Iglesia Apóstoles y Profetas, which operated out of a back room on a residential property on South 2nd Street in San Jose. The church was led by Aureli's grandfather, René Trigueros Hernandez, a 59-year-old man who served as its pastor. At some point, the family came to believe that little Aureli was possessed by an evil spirit. The specific trigger remains unclear, though investigators later learned that the family believed the child might have seen something disturbing on her mother's cell phone, and this was interpreted as a sign of demonic influence. On September 24, 2021, Aureli's mother, 25-year-old Claudia Hernandez, and her 19-year-old uncle, René Aron Hernandez Santos, brought the child to the church to perform an exorcism. The grandfather joined them. What followed was more than 12 hours of sustained, brutal abuse inflicted on a toddler. The three adults held Airly down, rotating between positions, with one person holding her by the face and neck, another around her torso, and the third around her legs. They tried to force her to vomit, believing this would expel the demon. They shoved their fingers down her throat, causing multiple injuries to her mouth and tongue. They squeezed her neck with enough force to render her unconscious multiple times. They applied pressure to her torso from front and back. Throughout the ordeal, the little girl fought desperately to escape. Court documents revealed that even as she was being held down and suffocated, Airly looked at her mother and said the words, "I love you." She had not been given any food and barely any water in the 24 hours leading up to her death. When Airly finally stopped moving, the family did not call for help. According to statements made by Claudia Hernandez to police, she believed that God had told her that he had taken Airly, and that the child's death was because of demons. In a recorded conversation between Claudia and her brother while they were in custody, Claudia reportedly said they would not be found guilty for what they did. The Santa Clara County medical examiner, Dr. Michelle Jordan, performed the autopsy and determined that Airly died of asphyxia caused by a combination of mechanical asphyxia and smothering. The child's body showed internal bleeding, injuries consistent with being squeezed and held down with tremendous force, and trauma to her mouth and throat from the repeated attempts to induce vomiting. Dr. Jordan testified that there was no realistic scenario in which the child's death could have been accidental. Airly's death did not become public knowledge for nearly 8 months. It was only when police, investigating a separate and unrelated kidnapping case, searched the church property and uncovered evidence of what had happened that the full horror came to light. All 3 family members were charged with felony child abuse resulting in death. Prior to his arrest, the grandfather admitted to performing the exorcism, though he denied it was technically an exorcism, even while acknowledging that the goal was to rid the child of demonic possession. He told investigators that during the ritual, the 3-year-old had been acting like the girl from the movie, The Exorcist. The preliminary hearing in the case took place in March of 2024, with the judge hearing testimony from investigators and the chief medical examiner over the course of several days. Lead investigator Lieutenant J.J. Vallejo of the San Jose Police Department took the stand and recounted his interviews with all 3 defendants, describing how the family genuinely believed the 3-year-old was possessed and that the ritual was necessary to liberate her. Vallejo recounted a particularly chilling recorded conversation between Claudia and her brother in which she said that God had taken Airly and everything was going to be okay, while also cautioning that it was going to look like they intended to kill her, but they did not. The defense attorneys challenged the prosecution's characterization of the events, but the chief medical examiner was unequivocal in her testimony. There was no scenario in which the child's death could be considered accidental. Smothering, she told the court, cannot be accidental. The case was eventually ordered to proceed to trial by jury. If convicted, all 3 defendants face life in prison. Airley's death also revealed another disturbing connection. The church where the exorcism took place was later searched in connection with a completely separate crime, the kidnapping of a 3-month-old baby boy in April of 2022, suggesting that the environment surrounding this makeshift church harbored dangers that extended far beyond the walls of its backroom sanctuary. These are the stories that don't make it into horror movies, because no filmmaker would dare tell them the way they actually happened. In every case, the pattern is the same. A vulnerable person, often suffering from undiagnosed or untreated mental illness, is identified as being possessed by someone who claims spiritual authority. Medical help is refused or ignored. Physical violence is justified as spiritual warfare, and by the time it's over, someone is dead. The demons that killed these people weren't supernatural entities from another realm. They were the very human forces of ignorance, isolation, unchecked power, and the terrible things that can happen when faith becomes a weapon instead of a comfort. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the suffering in these stories was undeniably, horrifyingly real. If these stories gave you something to think about, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it lets me keep bringing you stories like these. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.